Last week I joined the local community to mark the second anniversary since the tragedy of the Grenfell fire at a moving church service and a vigil to remember the victims and their families. A few days before the second anniversary, I wrote to the Prime Minister saying that the government's failure to deliver on the pledges made following the fire had been nothing short of shameful. It's simply unacceptable that 2 years on, 17 families whose homes were destroyed are still living in temporary or emergency accommodation. The community continues to feel ignored and neglected, having to fight for every piece of support from the council, from receiving legal advice to accessing mental health services and simply understanding their rights. What's more, our failed building regulation system remains largely unchanged, and the testing programme of existing buildings has been far too slow. Thousands of people across the country are still living in homes with unsafe cladding. The government's response to the consultation on the social housing green paper, lauded by the Secretary of State as a landmark opportunity for major reform, has still not been published. The fire at Samuel Garside in Barking last week shows the risk of flammable materials is not limited to high-rise buildings. The government's combustible material ban after the Grenfell only applies to buildings over 18 metres, and so it's likely the combustible material at Samuel Garside could still be used in new low and mid-rise buildings. This shows just how far the reforms have fallen short of what's needed. In my letter, I urge the Prime Minister to use her remaining time in office to increase support for the Grenfell community, deliver meaningful reforms to building regulations, speed up remediation of existing buildings, and commit to installing sprinklers in high-rise blocks. I also urged her to implement national reforms to strengthen tenants' voices that could have helped prevent this tragedy from happening in the first place. Whoever replaces Theresa May as Prime Minister must make it a priority to finally act on the issues that affect the Grenfell community and people across the country. We owe it to the 72 people who lost their lives at Grenfell Tower, their families, friends, and all those impacted by what happened 2 years ago.
Well, thank you for that answer. Could I remind you that, not that I think it's necessary, that the Hackett Review reported a year ago that implementation has only just begun and the legislation is not expected until 2021. Whilst the government introduced a temporary ban on flammable cladding on new residential buildings over 18 metres, nothing was said about other tall buildings such as the flats in Barking, which you mentioned, which went up like a torch. Fire testing, the wide variety of other types of cladding didn't begin until the 30th of April this year, and even then doesn't include fire fumes and smoke, which are the killers.
Yeah.
In June 2018, they announced a joint inspection task force to speed up private sector remediation, but it's still not operational. It took until a month ago for the government to allocate some funds for private sector remediation, but bids can't even be made till July, let alone work commence. As of May this year, there are more private sector residential buildings with no remediation plans in place compared to the number that are actually being fixed, including over 100 in London. The public inquiry and police investigation are months behind, and the sorry earlier history of ignored warnings and coroner's recommendations is appalling, as set out in the comprehensive article in Inside Housing magazine in the current edition. Would you agree the list of late or non-activity by this Brexit-obsessed Conservative government is little more than an insult to the memory of the 72 victims of the fire, to the survivors of the local community, and to the 4,600 social and 10,600 private sector London families still living in fear in blocks with dangerous cladding on them?
Absolutely. I'd say your question is actually an indictment of the neglect this government's shown over the last 2 years. We'll put aside the neglect before the Grenfell Tower fire. The delay is frankly incredible. The government could have introduced interim measures, failed to do so. You're right to remind us that any progress may not happen until 2021 at the soonest in relation to legislation. We've got a big issue in relation to ACM cladding in social housing, ACM cladding in private housing, but other combustible materials that's not ACM cladding. You're right to remind us in relation to those buildings below 18 metres. We saw what happened in Barking last week. Big concern around new buildings could be being built with combustible cladding that's not being addressed because of the government's delay. And so I think your question, you should circulate as an indictment on this government's track record over the last 2 years and before.
Thank you. And what do you think the prospects are of justice for Grenfell if former Mayor Boris Johnson were to become Prime Minister? A man who broke his election promise not to cut the fire brigade with 2014 brigade cuts, axing 10 fire stations, 14 fire engines and 553 firefighter posts. And when I challenged about it, when he was sat where you are, he simply replied, "Get stuffed." When I challenged him about the 26th of October 2015 Camden Road fatal fire, where the first fire engine took 30 minutes to get there because he closed Belsize fire station, and no fewer than 10% of London's fire stations were off the run, he replied, "You're talking total ... Another of his broken promises after the 2014 cuts was there'd be no more cuts, but he axed a further 13 fire engines in 2015-16. And amongst the worst of all, Brian Coleman, former AM and then chairman of the Fire Authority, exposed his use of four-letter foul language about the families bereaved in the 7/7 terror attacks, victims, hardly compassionate conservatism, as revealed in the Sunday Mirror this last week. Do you consider any of the Conservative leadership contenders, especially front-runner Boris Johnson, will deliver justice for Grenfell?
Assembly Member Dismore, I thank you for removing the prop. Thank you.
Chair, I think all I'd say is this. Whoever the Prime Minister is our Prime Minister, and he will be the Prime Minister for the families, the victims, the survivors affected by Grenfell Tower. And it's really important that he looks after the most vulnerable and uses that as a criteria for success. The evidence I've seen from the track record of the favourite to be the next Prime Minister concerns me. I also think the idea that you can hide from your record by failing to turn up to broadcast hustings, failing to give yourself scrutiny, won't wash once you become the Prime Minister, and his record will come out. The key thing is whether he's learnt from that. I hope he has genuinely, as somebody who loves this city, wants a Prime Minister to do the best for our country and our city. We'll have to wait and see.